Start. Threats in this position are queen takes pawn, queen takes pawn, rook takes pawn, check. Checks in this position are queen to e7, check, queen to e8, check, queen to h4, check, rook takes pawn, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Rook takes pawn, check, rook to d7, queen to e6, king to c8, rook takes rook, queen takes rook, queen to e5, rook to d8, queen takes knight. Let's see the next puzzle. The threats are rook takes pawn, check, rook takes pawn, queen takes knight, check, queen takes pawn, check. Checks in puzzle position are rook takes pawn, check, queen to f5, check, queen takes knight, check, queen to g5, check, queen to h6, check, queen takes pawn, check, queen to e4, check. The best move in puzzle position is rook to e5, rook to d8, king to f1, rook to d1, check, king to e2. Let's continue. Here are threats in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn, queen takes rook, queen takes pawn. The checks are rook to d8, check. The answer is rook to d8, check, king to h7, queen to d3, check, g6, rook takes rook, queen takes rook, queen to d4, queen to e1, check, king to g2, rook takes pawn, check, queen takes rook. Another one. Here are threats in puzzle position. Rook takes knight, check, king takes knight. Checks in puzzle position are b5, check, queen to f7, check, queen to g8, check, rook takes knight, check. The answer is b5, check, rook to e7, queen to e6, queen takes pawn, rook takes knight, check, bishop takes rook, queen takes bishop, check, king to g8, queen takes rook, queen takes queen, bishop takes queen. Next puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position. Pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn, check, knight takes knight. Here are the checks. d4, check, knight takes pawn, check, knight to c4, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Pawn takes pawn, knight to d2, pawn takes pawn. Next puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position. There are no threats in this position. Checks in puzzle position are rook to f4, check, rook to e1, check. The answer is rook to e7, rook to a8, rook takes pawn. Let's continue. Threats in puzzle position are knight takes pawn, queen takes pawn, queen takes pawn. Here are checks in puzzle position. Queen to h2, check. The best move in puzzle position is knight takes pawn, queen to e4, check, king to f8. One more. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are rook takes rook, check. Checks in puzzle position are rook takes rook, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Rook takes rook, check. Pawn takes rook, king to f4, king to e6, king to g5, king to e5, f3. One more. Here are the threats. There are no threats in this position. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. e5, check. Solution to the puzzle is g5. Pawn takes pawn. e5, check. King to c3. Pawn takes pawn. Let's see the next puzzle. The threats are bishop takes pawn, bishop takes pawn, knight takes pawn, knight takes pawn, knight takes bishop, queen takes pawn, check, queen takes rook, check, queen takes pawn, check. The checks are queen takes pawn, check, queen to g2, check, queen takes rook, check, queen takes pawn, check. The puzzle is solved using d4, f3, bishop takes pawn. Next puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position. Bishop takes knight, rook takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. The answer is bishop to d4, knight takes pawn, knight takes knight, knight takes knight, queen to c2. Next, threats in puzzle position are there are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. The best move in puzzle position is King to e3. Rook to f5. h4. Rook to f7. Rook to g1. Let's see the next puzzle. Threats in this position are: knight takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. The best move in puzzle position is king to g5, knight to g2, knight to f3, knight to e3, h2, rook to c1, knight to g1. Let us go to the next puzzle. Threats in puzzle position are: king takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. Solution to the puzzle is king takes pawn, queen to c7, queen takes pawn. Next puzzle, here are the threats: queen takes knight check, queen takes knight, rook takes pawn check. Checks in this position are: queen takes knight check, queen to d8 check, rook takes pawn check, h4 check. The answer is rook takes pawn check, queen takes rook, h4 check, king to f6, rook takes queen check, king takes rook, queen to f7 check, knight to f6, g4 check, king to e5, queen takes knight. One more. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are: queen takes queen. Checks in this position are: knight to f6 check. Solution to the puzzle is queen to h4, queen takes pawn, knight to g5, queen takes rook check, queen takes queen. Next puzzle, the threats are: there are no threats in this position. The checks are g5 check. The answer is king to d5, king to e3, c5, pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, f4, c4. Next puzzle, let us look at threats in puzzle position. There are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. The answer is king to c5, b4 check, pawn takes pawn check, king to d3, b3, king to c3, king to d5. Next puzzle, here are threats in puzzle position: queen takes pawn check, rook takes pawn, rook takes rook. Checks in puzzle position are: queen takes pawn check. The answer is rook takes pawn, rook takes rook, queen takes pawn check, rook to g2, queen takes pawn check, king to h1, rook takes rook, knight takes rook, queen takes rook check. Let's see the next puzzle. Threats in puzzle position are: there are no threats in this position. Checks in puzzle position are: bishop to f8 check. Solution to the puzzle is bishop to d6, knight to d5, c2. Another one. Let us look at threats in puzzle position: queen takes pawn, knight takes pawn, bishop takes pawn check, king takes knight, rook takes pawn, rook takes knight. Checks in puzzle position are: knight to d6 check, bishop takes pawn check. Solution to the puzzle is rook takes pawn, bishop takes knight, queen takes bishop, queen takes rook, bishop takes pawn check, queen takes bishop, queen takes queen check. Another puzzle. Here are the threats: rook takes pawn, bishop takes pawn check, bishop takes pawn, king takes bishop, queen takes queen, queen takes pawn. Checks in this position are: bishop takes pawn check. The answer is queen takes queen, rook takes queen, king takes bishop, rook to e7, h3. Next, threats in puzzle position are: there are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. Solution to the puzzle is king to b7, bishop to c5, bishop takes bishop, pawn takes bishop, d4, b4, king to c6. Let us go to the next puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position: bishop takes pawn check, queen takes pawn, queen takes pawn check, bishop takes pawn. Here are checks in puzzle position: bishop takes pawn check, queen takes pawn check. Solution to the puzzle is bishop takes pawn check, king takes bishop, queen takes pawn. Another puzzle. Threats in this position are: queen takes pawn check. Checks in this position are: queen to f4 check, Queen to f8, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen to e3, check. Solution to the puzzle is Queen to f4, check. g5. Queen takes rook. Queen takes queen. Rook takes queen. h4. Rook to e8. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.